Welcome to my April 9th, 2024 webinar entitled Living on the Narcissism Spectrum. I've been working on narcissism, what it is and how it affects people and how we can work with it to make people who feel like they're on that spectrum in a more emphatic way be happier, have greater well-being, and do better in society. I started with some questions, which you've all read on the invitation. Am I self-centered or centered in myself? Pause here, because I think that's actually a really important question. And there are ways of characterizing those things, and we'll try to touch on that a bit tonight as we go along. But it's really the fundamental question about narcissism, and raises the point that is the ultimate point of this webinar, I think, which is, where do I fit on the spectrum? Not that we're going to measure it in any particular way, but just have that sense that there is a range of expression of characteristics of our personality. You could say of our ego. It's a perfectly good way to say that. And we need to see which things may be interfering with our happiness and well-being. And then we will kind of make a list of those things and work on them during the group clearing session. So the first question, am I centered or centered in am I self-centered or centered in myself? Second question I put is, if I care for others, can I still take care of myself? I find this issue to be extremely common. And it often comes up with people who are in a situation where they're caring for elderly parents, sick family members, or just generally, even in their social interactions with people not in their families. Are they caregivers to others? And if they are doing that, are they taking care of themselves? The third question was, am I prideful or just proud of myself? Am I prideful or just proud of myself? In other words, do I see my own accomplishments and, just recognize, what talents and abilities I have? Or is there something prideful about my recognizing my talents and abilities? And finally, if I consider myself special and unique, like my parents said I am, because that's really a thing parents do these days, am I narcissistic or just honest? Good question, a good question. So those questions help frame our motivation for undertaking this discussion and looking at ourselves and seeing, what qualities of narcissism and to what degree we have those qualities are within ourselves. I look at narcissism as a set of qualities of character and behavior that we all share to varying degrees. I am not alone in that. Many psychologists do that, but it is not something that is formally recognized in psychology, really. I think it's coming to be, and I'm really, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not active in the field, so I won't pretend to understand where the field is at today. But I think more and more people are realizing that, yeah, just about everybody has at least some qualities you might say are narcissistic. And we're going to go through those qualities a little bit so that we can make a list for ourselves. But, narcissism is a set of qualities of behavior and character that we all share. And just as we are all on the autism spectrum, and I've discussed that in another webinar, we are all on the narcissism spectrum, for better or worse. Seeing narcissism on a spectrum from neurotypical, meaning an average person, to neuroatypical, a little more extreme, allows us to avoid judgment and to treat each person as a normal variant. In other words, we just treat them as people. We don't have to say, oh, we're going to put a label on you. Now, in the field of psychology, which is very much following a medical model, psychologists make diagnoses, and there are code numbers in the DSM, whatever number it is now. I'm a little out of the field. DSM is Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and it's a reference manual with codes, numbers that identify different what they call diagnoses. My view is, I think all of you must know from working with me, is that, and I got this from my father, by the way, who was a psychiatrist. I don't like diagnoses. That's putting labels on people, and then we wind up referring or treating or looking at people as they are labeled rather than as people, complex as we are, with varying characteristics expressed to varying degrees. So I look at it as the spectrum, as just looking at each person as a normal variant. Now, before I go on with all of that, I got to talk a little bit about where the term narcissism came from. It goes back even to the BC period. There's at least one writing of a mythology dated to 80 BC. And then there were many writings that go up into the even, I think, 400s, if I remember correctly. And it's not important right now, although you can look it up. Wikipedia has some very nice articles about narcissism as mythology. But the whole thing about Narcissus, as we call him in English, and different stories have slightly different variations on the name. The story of Narcissus fundamentally is that he was extremely self-absorbed and happened in some way to see his reflection in a pool and was completely enamored and desirous of the reflection, to the point that a beautiful maiden who was very interested in him and thought he was very beautiful was completely ignored and shunned. And in various versions of the story, she got pissed off about that and did some bad things to him, but for his egocentrism. But in that story, and fairly consistently through those early centuries, there was self-absorption, of course, and even autoeroticism and homosexuality, along with a lack of regard for others. In those days, apparently, at least in the literature, such homosexual tendencies were acceptable. I didn't know that until I looked it up, and but I had heard of the story. And when I was reading the story, I thought, it describes somebody who's attracted to somebody who is male. And so it's a very homosexual story. That's all just about self-absorption and lack of regard for others. And we don't need to go further with that here. But it's kind of interesting background. There's also some very nice artwork that has been created in later centuries. And it's kind of fun to look at those pictures and see what was regarded as extremely beautiful at different times in Western culture. So what is narcissism and why are we talking about it? When our character works for ourselves as well as for others, in other words, when we are able to function in society, we may feel confident, capable, successful, and worthy of life's rewards, popularity, rich financial compensation, and elevated social position. This does not necessarily come about out of negative human qualities like greed and envy, but just out of a sense of being fulfilled as a person, just a natural tendency. Popularity, rich financial compensation, elevated social position. In other words, when our qualities are well balanced, we can be successful. When our qualities of character are exaggerated, that's a good way to look at it. When they're exaggerated, we may feel self-important, empowered, and entitled. We may also hold unreal expectations for admiration and social status, and a sense of a prerogative. This is a good one. a sense of prerogative to exploit, belittle, and even hurt others without regard for their feelings or well being. So I'd like to turn now to the qualities of narcissism. Trying to keep this moving. I got a lot of material. Um, but we're going to turn now to a wonderful, and of course, it isn't where I expected it to be. It's probably right here. Um, 9 symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder. So this is from a psychologist's point of view, but it's really nice to lay out what all of these qualities are. Naturally, we identify them most easily when they're in a most exaggerated form, but they can exist to a minor degree in us or anywhere along, a range from just a little or almost none to hugely exaggerated. Um, the general qualities are grandiosity and self importance, fantasies of success, perfection, or power. Now, we may also have some actual success, perfection, and power, but the fantasy is that we see ourselves as much better than we really are. A strong conviction of being special and unique. Again, parents say to us, "Oh, you're so special, you're so unique. I love you dearly." So we take that, but it can get very exaggerated and give us a strong conviction of being special and unique. A need for admiration and praise. Um, you know, we all like to get some admiration, some recognition, some praise. Um, it's a part of most business cultures and to some degree social cultures, although there's also a counter culture of that, that says, well, we shouldn't praise we shouldn't praise others and puff them up. Um, there's a strong sense, or can be a strong sense, of entitlement. I'm entitled to this. A pattern of exploiting others for personal gain. Low empathy. And when we say low empathy, what we really mean is a lack of concern, a lack of conscience. It's not a lack of awareness of the feelings of others. That's a misunderstanding. Unfortunately, we tend to use the word empathy, but it's really lacking compassion for others. And then envy, jealousy, and distrust. These are very common. Um, and there's distrust is actually a really important one because uh, when these qualities are exaggerated, it's very hard for us to be confident about others because we're quixotic ourselves. We change our opinions. We shift our positions on things. I've seen businessmen do things where they'll make an offer and the person will come back with something and then they'll go, well, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do it differently. And then and that I've seen that happen again and again in a negotiation where they say, well, we'll do this. And then they say, no, I won't do that. I'm going to do something different. So that kind of thing happens. And finally, arrogance, haughtiness, and scorn. Now, somebody had written to me after they saw the invitation for this webinar, and they said, well, how are you going to avoid talking about, the big examples that we're all familiar with of malignant narcissism, the really extreme form of narcissistic personality disorder? And I said, that's not why we're doing the webinar. It's not to identify who's narcissistic. It's to be able to recognize the qualities within ourselves, which may not be very much expressed, only a little, but if they're in any kind of problem area for us, if they're creating problems for us, that's really the point of the webinar. So we're not going to talk about, people that we might say all know. These qualities, in order to make a diagnosis, they have to last over time. There are different types of narcissism. And I'll just mention these because I think they help us to get a frame of reference in considering our own qualities. These are not part of the diagnostic criteria. These are just ways people look at it, gives us an opportunity to do, studies on narcissism. But so there's two different classifications I'm going to use. One is 4 types and one is 5 types. So the 4 type one is grandiose or overt narcissism. Those are pretty easy to spot. Vulnerable, covert narcissism, also called closet narcissism. Um, High functioning narcissism and malignant narcissism. High functioning narcissism are those who are quite self centered, but they do well in their occupation, in their social relationships. Um, they're not so compelled to take advantage of others. That does not mean that they're not good negotiators, good, as we say, good businessmen, that they know how to drive a bargain. And they may be very successful financially, socially. They can pull it off, but they are quite self-centered, and usually that extends to their immediate family, or even their kind of extended family. So it's them, and then everybody else is. Pardon me. There's us. That's the extended family, and then them is everybody else, and the others are people that we work with, so to speak, that we negotiate with, that we try to make deals with, but that we don't um, consider to be us. Now, the 5 types of narcissism, this scale has overt, grandiose, or they have another term for it, agenic, covert, antagonistic, which is a greater tendency to rivalry and competition, more prone to arguing and to arrogance. And some psychologists consider that a subtype of overt narcissism. Communal narcissism, which means a group, and that could be like a religious group or a cult, um, practically any group where a leader typically is revered and you have a lot of followers. Pardon me. And then there's malignant narcissism, which is just narcissism gone wild. I want to go over some of these qualities now, try to move along quickly, but to give you some more concrete stuff. And you can make notes if you want to, qualities within yourself. Grandiosity and self importance. These really, grandiosity is the defining symptom of narcissistic personality disorder, but grandiosity means I think really highly of myself and I act that way. Well, it's good to act as if you have confidence, right? So where's the line between grandiosity and just I'm confident? I can't draw that line, but you can for yourself. Is your confidence maybe, and maybe it's that your confidence is a little in question, so you make up for it with a degree of grandiosity. You put on that you're really, quite special in some ways. Um, so anyway, grandiosity. That can mean bragging, exaggerating, or lying, particularly about past accomplishments. I think we're all aware of a certain politician um, in the House of Representatives, I believe it was, um, who got himself into a lot of trouble because it turned out he had lied about essentially everything about his background. He had hardly said anything that was true, or at least in terms of his accomplishments. So that kind of carrying on is an exaggerated characteristic. We probably all lie a little bit about who we are in certain occasions, but if it's only in certain circumstances and we don't do it a lot and we don't make big exaggerations and we don't try to, like get a job claiming that we had studied at some university or had some fellowship or some such thing, and it turns out that we really didn't, you know. So and then we can get ultimately, can lose our status when that's discovered. Devaluing or criticizing others, common, common, common. Anger or rage when achievements go unrecognized, feeling disappointed, and really, really more than just disappointed, really uh, angered about not being recognized. Um, regularly describing personal attributes such as intelligence, one's power, strength, wealth, attractiveness, or sexual appeal, saying it out loud, so to speak, flaunting it. It doesn't have to be in words necessarily, but spending a lot of money, flying first class when that's probably a bit of a financial stretch, but we do it so we are comfortable and we feel good. We're pampering ourselves, staying in a fancy hotel rather than a less fancy hotel. Why? Because it makes us feel good about ourselves. So that kind of behavior. Fantasies of perfection and superiority. Um, Imagining, here's a few interesting ones here. I was just looking over the list. A few interesting ones. Um, Imagining that somebody who's superior to you in work position, a boss of some sort or supervisor, singles you out for your flawless work in front of others, not actually doing it, that you have the fantasy of that happening. Attracting celebrities, getting them to fall in love with you and begging for a date, imagining that thing happening. Meeting and becoming friends with famous people you admire. I know people who at least claim to be friends with famous people. I don't know if it's true. The stories sound good, but this person, they always sound good, and it makes you wonder to what degree they are exaggerated. Also, their physical prowess, skiing, and that sort of sports stuff. Winning prestigious awards for creative work. You may not actually win them, but you imagine that you win them. Earning praise and admiration for rescuing somebody from danger. Um, I think a lot of doctors, myself included, like to do critical care work because it puts them in a position, plus the training and capability of saving lives. And that feels good. Is that bad? No, it's not. But you say, why did you take that job? Why do you work in the ICU? Because you like the excitement, you like saving lives. So um, these may be fantasies, though, that you are doing that kind of thing, or making donations to charitable organizations that help others, and you feel like, well, I'm helping others, right? So you may actually do those things. They're not always fantasies, um, but that's a typical thing. A sense of specialness and uniqueness. I don't think I really need to talk about that. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. A need for praise, attention, and admiration. This is a big area for narcissistic behavior. Um, People have a high opinion of themselves and need the praise, attention, and admiration. Even the low functioning, maybe even particularly the low functioning types of narcissists, that we spoke about, the vulnerable um, or closet narcissist uh, may may have that kind of a need. Um, Psychologists talk about difficulty with whole object relations. One of the qualities is a tendency to focus on specifics in somebody. We see somebody and we don't like something about their appearance, for instance, or something about the way they talk, even the sound of their voice. And so we reject them as a possibility of somebody that we could be close to because of one or two things, and we're not seeing the whole person. Because if we saw the whole person, they might be a very good friend indeed, or somebody we'd really like to know and enjoy. And maybe you have friends that you go like, well, yeah, I like them, but you know, there are some things about them I think are great, and other things are not so great. But I can manage that. I can still be a friend. I can still like them. So that kind of a situation. Now that's a balanced way of approaching it. Certainly a need for praise and attention. It's a big part of this. Entitled behavior, excuse me, if you believe you're special and superior to others, you might expect to receive special treatment and privileges to match your expectations. In the case of someone who has narcissistic personality characteristics, entitlement can show up in various ways and across situations. For instance, if you work really hard and do a really good job, better than anyone else, you feel that you deserve to be able to set your own schedule. You feel an entitlement that comes out of that. Blaming others, like because they're making noise, keeping you from doing what you want to do, or maybe they just interrupt or they make just too much noise in the workplace. And you have that attitude, they don't realize how inconsiderate that is when they really have no awareness of your situation. Or, pardon me, I'm going to have to wet my throat. Let's get down to a tendency to exploit others. I'm going to just describe this and then I'm going to talk about where this fits on the spectrum. Using tactics of manipulation is one of the most common symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder. People who become salesmen often have this characteristic, a tendency to manipulate others and to actually have down, and it seems to come just naturally to them, the ability to manipulate others with, compliments and, upselling and doing all other kinds of stuff. Another characteristic of narcissistic personality disorder, in this same vein of exploiting others, is playing the victim. Playing the victim. Part of that is blaming others, and part of that is trying to appeal to those who you want to manipulate, that you are being treated so unfairly. And, the other, those who are treating you that way or supposedly treating you that way, have it out for you. Putting others down, insisting others help and support yourself, so that you don't have to take care of yourself so much. Complimenting someone to receive praise back. Now, this is one of those subtle ones, right? You give somebody a compliment. Oh, you look so nice, or I like, whatever, the clothes you're wearing, or the car you're driving, or the job you did, or whatever. And your goal in doing that is to get them to say something nice about you because you need to hear it. That's a very common one, and it's subtle. Failing to recognize when you, as the person, make unrealistic demands of others. Treating people unkindly when they're unwilling to do things for you, or lying or deceiving others to get your needs met. Now, again, the term low empathy comes up. I've already commented on that it really isn't about caring for others. It's about not caring for others, but being aware of how they feel so you can manipulate them. But one who has these qualities may not express feelings, have little interest in other people's difficulties. If somebody starts talking about some problem they have, they just kind of dismiss it, walk away. And avoid doing things for others unless it specifically benefits oneself. Envy, jealousy, and distrust, I've already covered, I think, adequately. Arrogance, haughtiness, and scorn. Having a high and mighty attitude or being snobbish is pretty common. I have seen that in so many just regular social circles. I remember an example. It was so struck. I overheard a conversation between a group of women, and one of the women was saying, "Oh, my husband and I just went and vacationed in such and such a place, really nice resort place. And we stayed in this beautiful facility and it had this, that, and the other thing. And all they were talking about, all they were doing, they weren't sharing useful information, or they were kind of putting it in the context, oh, you ought to go do this. But what they're really doing is saying, look how wonderful my lifestyle is. Look how wonderful we are, how successful we are. Another characteristic under haughtiness and arrogance and scorn is having contempt for people who make mistakes. Not being tolerant of mistakes, not being tolerant of one's own mistakes too. Scorn for those who don't recognize one's superiority. A tendency to patronize ordinary people. Yeah, they're okay. We don't really care about them. And aggressive or sharp responses to perceived criticism. So those are the 9 symptoms worth knowing, and I hope you made some notes as you went along. Let me talk a little bit now about the spectrum of narcissism, because I want to move towards wrapping this up. There's so much material. The spectrum of narcissism ranges, I think, and this is not based on empirical information. This is just my sense of it from working with people. It ranges from the vulnerable to the high functioning, ones who are successful, the grandiose, is getting a little exaggerated, to the malignant, the oh boy, this is really something. And then taking that malignant narcissism even further to sociopathic and psychopathic at the end of the spectrum. The thing that characterizes, to me at least, sociopathic narcissism, and I put those 2 words together. Psychologists do not usually put those 2 words together, although they recognize sociopathic tendencies in malignant narcissism. They don't usually put the 2 terms directly together. But sociopathic narcissism is where the need to get over on other people, the need to be able to manipulate and use other people and to deceive them just for the sake of doing it sometimes. That's what characterizes a sociopathic narcissist. And then a psychopathic narcissist goes one step further. They have an actual need and often the ability to hurt others, and they find pleasure not just in extorting others, in using others, in manipulating others. They find pleasure in actually hurting other people. And they will often do it. And sometimes it is against the law. But they can be very dangerous people, and they're very good at it. The character Hannibal Lecter, I hope that's fictional. I think it is, was a psychopathic narcissist. There was one involved in Bones, the TV series Bones, and there was also a codependent. And I haven't talked about codependence, and I think we need to do that a little bit. Just as in alcoholism, you have people that enable, and other addictions, people who enable the addict, and they are actually kind of reciprocal people to the addict, in the sense that where the addict has certain characteristics are strong, these people tend to be very dependent. And we often use the term sycophant to describe them. Sycophant, sycophant. It's one of the words I had to learn in the last, I don't know, decade regarding political characters and the people that follow them and enable them. And you think about it, probably virtually every politician is at least to some degree narcissistic. And to the degree to which they need a following to get elected, that reinforces that notion, but they may develop a kind of cult-like following. And that's that group narcissism that I talked about. But most narcissists need people to give them praise, to puff them up, to make them look good, to tell them how wonderful they are. And those people tend to be very subservient. And I think generally those are the people who are vulnerable as narcissists. And they may be very quiet, they may be very kind of introverted, um, or they may have their own areas in which they express themselves, but in relationship to somebody who is, a leader type, they may be, the person who acts as a sycophant and just, enables the person to do what they do, which looks good at first, at least. So I think that covers everything I wanted to say about this, and I should give you a moment to, if you haven't already, put anything in the chat. I don't see anything new in the chat, but if you have any questions or comments, um, this would be a good time to do that, and we'll give you about a minute to do that. And while we're doing that, I'm going to just point out that my next webinar is set for May 14th, and that's going to be managing karma, pardon me, when managing karma isn't sufficient for healing. We gave a lecture just recently about managing karma and how we can deal with that. That sometimes we just pay off the debt, but sometimes we do things to pay it off, but without having to go through a great deal or continued at least on a path of suffering. But what happens when it isn't sufficient? And I came across this when I was working with a client who had cancer, and it looked like they had dealt with all the issues, all the emotions that underlay the formation of the cancer. And I couldn't figure out why they weren't getting well. They were kind of in a holding pattern. They were stable. It wasn't actually getting worse, but it wasn't getting better. And I thought, we've covered everything. And then I went back and I looked and I found something that had remained unresolved in the past, but seemed to be resolved in the present. It was like something had been left behind that was infected, if you will, that was sore, that was malignant. And that's a better word for it because it was a malignancy that came up, that showed up decades later. But there was this thing and it was a family pattern, and also something past lives. And so we had to go back and clean that up. And it didn't come to the surface easily. It took a long time from sitting with it, trying to figure out where it was and what it was about. And finally it emerged. And we had I had a clear sense of it, which I then could share with the client of where this had come from. So that'll be the subject next time. And it's, the focus of the whole point of the lecture, I guess, is what do you do when you do all of the things you should do and you still don't get well? And so anybody with chronic illness that just isn't turning around, you're going to learn some things, hopefully get some help. But even with minor things, where you say, well, I don't really have some problem, but you'll get a lot out of the webinar also. And I guess I should make a quick comment. I'm still not seeing any comments in the chat. I should make a quick comment. I was working with a client who had been severely abused by an adult in a leadership position, in a position where they put themselves in a position where they should be trusted, and the person that was involved as a child, trusted them and got drawn into, I'm trying to think of the word they use, cultivated, I think, and led into a situation where they were severely abused. And they had dealt with the abuse, and they had that pretty well together, but there was still something remaining. And what was remaining was that they wanted the abuser to fess up, to become contrite. And contrition was very difficult because the person basically felt no guilt, shame, or um, responsibility. They just didn't take that on themselves. And so I had to go back in and recognize that the abuser, given their lack of compassion, um, we needed a different approach. And the approach was to show them the pain they had caused themselves. And that pain was largely a loss of social status. The abuse had come out and they had been fired from their position. Um, and, it was very humiliating. They don't tolerate humiliation very well, or they don't tolerate not being praised. And, so they feel very badly. So I had to show them that pain was the motivation for them to change and to regain their status, not only among their peers, but also before God, because it was a religious context that this happened. Um, and, to not have that special status that they had earned in their church group was extremely painful. And the greatest fear was being um, re- rejected by God. They were trying to say, "But I've served and I've done yet, etc." And there was this panel of priests, and this was not on the human plane. But I found that there was this panel of priests that basically were saying, you're not going to heaven for what you did. It's not going to happen. You have to actually deal with what you did. So their contrition was based on pain, not on guilt. But it was very interesting. So that's kind of one last and rather bizarre story about healing. But that did free my client to be completely well. It was a physical thing, to be completely well. So it was very interesting doing that work. Um, and I felt, myself kind of privileged to be able to go into that level of existence and that, deal with those circumstances and feelings with somebody who was no longer even incarnate. Okay, seeing no messages, I will end this recording. Um, Again, May 14th, make a note, managing karma, pardon me, when managing karma isn't sufficient for healing.